Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And thank you, everyone. I want to thank everyone for being here with us today on this beautiful Sunday, and extending the KAKT American Knowledge Team. Before I get into it, I just want to thank a special angel who has helped me this week greatly. And I don't want to mention any names, but they know who they are, and it's with extreme gratitude that I'm conveying that today. But I also want to extend extreme gratitude to all the panelists at the meeting today, because we have to question what is more powerful, the work of one or the work of the many? And it becomes a difficult question in terms of understanding, because it has to do with positive and negative charges. It has to do with the direction of flow. It has to do with the field strength. And it has to do with our understanding of how things work. And do we understand how things work? So we've had a lot of contentious issues. And so here we go. The KAKT Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We are in the advanced inertia stage, and we are going to talk today about chakra levels. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is March the 23rd, 2025, and this is part of the KAKT Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we left the intermediate inertia series, and what we were trying to demonstrate, of course, is that the effects of two fields create one. And in our point of view of that one field is really what is important. So is the arrival of that one field all we have, or is that part of an ongoing process to go to the next? And where exactly is this, and how can we determine our position? Because we don't really have a map per se. But as we go with this advanced inertia series, you can see that it's part of a continuous teaching process. And in addition to the thousands of hours that are teaching from the KAKT Foundation, we tried to distill it into smaller classes. And so we're discussing various advanced levels, trying to help not only the mature students, but the new students. So they have a lot to catch up, but maybe they can go a lot faster than we did in the initial stages. So This inertia that we're talking about, and a lot of us see it as a chakra, and we're trying to figure out, well, what do these chakra levels mean, and why are they so important? Well, it's only half the picture, you see, and this is the whole point, because what they tell us is like where exactly we are on the hesitancy highway. We know that it's the lowest energy state. And now many of the wagon trains are westward bound. And the reason for that is we are part of the new world, aren't we? And that new world was only basically explored 400 or 500 years, and the rest of the world seems to have been thousands of years. But is that true? I mean, and that's what our history tells us. But whether it's true or not is irrelevant. What is relevant is what has happened and transpired in the process, because we are searching for outer space. And so we have to raise our chakra levels to get on that plasma highway to our little pie in the sky. And we need to emphasize the fact that it's a little pie, a very little pie in the sky, and we all strive for it, and we place an enormous amount of importance on that. But the fact of the matter is, it's a little pie. And we do that at the expense of looking at the big pie. And the only reason we don't look at the big pie is because in many ways it's hidden from us. And the capabilities to explore that are also hidden from us. So how do we basically develop the means to explore that? And what we do is we go to bed every night. We have dreams. Most of us don't remember them, but we do sleep. And where exactly do we go when we sleep? And so very few people are able to ask that question, because very few people are able to answer that question. But there are people who do try and answer it, and the plasma science is definitely trying to answer that. And we try and put that together in a concise way. So we did it, scientifically speaking, by the books of INERTIA, Kodesh, book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matter, where we bring the matter, the dark matter, and the antimatter together. And these are all different energy states, and they come together to create one. And then there's the structure of light in book number 2, where we see that there are two matter states, and somehow the light travels from one to the other. And then book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, where the one matter state splits up into two, of which we have a sister universe, which seems to be far larger than our little tiny universe. But our tiny universe is acknowledged by only our little tiny presence on a tiny planet within there. So it's a small scheme of a small scheme. And one of the reasons that it's so small is because we're fragmented. And so for 370 weeks in a row, Rick Raman and the Universal Council have trying to bring together one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace. It's a lot of work. And it took a lot of understanding. And it took a lot of understanding of the role that we play and the true intention of what we're trying to achieve. And can we achieve that in a singular form? Or do we have to do that as a team? And what team are we talking about? Are we talking about the team that we can see? And that's what we're talking about today, because for some reason, as we got here, someone gave us some commandments. And most of us knew of 10, Now we added another 14 for a total of 24. Why do we need these commandments? Do plants have commandments? Do animals have commandments? So if we came from the transmutation highway and we want to go back to the transmutation highway, do we need these 10 commandments? Or do we need these 24 commandments? Or is that all there is? Are there more commandments that we need to know? And how do we summarize that? And so when we look at the connection to the universe, we find that the connection is through the carbon. And so we see the ratios where we look on the physical state, carbon 12 to carbon 12, in its duality is a one-to-one relationship. But when we get into the transition state, the carbon 14 is a 1-to-4 ratio to carbon 10. And when we get into carbon 16, the transmutation highway, the ratio is 2-to-1, carbon 16 to carbon 8. But this transmutation highway extends even further, because much of the highway is what we see, but even more of the highway is what we don't see. So again, we're only seeing our tiny little bit. And so it leaves us with a kind of a funny look at our life. And the point comes with respect to consistency, because that is relevant regardless of where you are in the universe. So some people believe that it should be chaotic. Our existence is random. And so that philosophy is also consistent within our history. But that is brought together by the scientific community that is looking for some kind of consistency in understanding, in the religious community looking for some consistency in our beliefs. But we're at the point now where we have to look at the practical application of bringing together the plasma science from the scientific and the religious community to come together. And in order to do that, we have to figure out what factor is at play. And the reason we have to look at that is because we are bringing two fields together. We are bringing two fields together to play as one. And that's kind of the theme today, because we see that there's an intensity relationship between the scientific community versus the spiritual community. And so what we're seeking is a magnetical and gravitational balance, which in the plasma science, we call it a MAGRAV. And so it's not a means of obliterating the previous fields. It's a matter of adding to the knowledge. And how fast we add to the knowledge is determined by the rate of change. And how can we change the rate of change? So we need to develop more skills. And so what we tried to do was develop our skills as four-wheelers and to understand the difference between natural creation and natural decay. But then we find out that anytime there is a creation, it comes from other fields. And so that becomes a kind of decay, but it's an unfortunate term because it seems to imply a gain as expense of a loss. But in the decay, it's also part of creation. And so that's a loss for the purpose of gain. And so which is it? Is it the creation or is it decay? And so it's both. because there is a bonding factor. That's what we're looking for, this inertia bonding factor. And without being able to explain it, well, we kind of have to fudge things because we may have a problem identifying whether it's a reflection or an illusion. And so here we are as pioneers in America still trying to figure out how to catch up to the rest of the world. And indeed, we do have to catch up to the rest of the world. But is it because we are weak, or is it because we've been undermined? And so we find that regardless of what that answer is, without making any commentary on that, each manifestation is a plasma inertia junction. So it becomes a midpoint. But a midpoint to what? It could be a midpoint to a lower level, it could be a midpoint to a higher level, or it could be a midpoint to a medium level. Whatever it is, it's a combination of dimensions. 3 dimensions of one transition matter with 3 dimensions of another transition matter brings together a transfer state dimension, and it gives you a choice which direction to go. And when you have this choice, one can make the conclusion one is right or what is wrong. But when we're looking at the transfer state from an energy standpoint, each energy transfer state is in a balanced state, which we call a maggrav. But then each side of that state is also a balance. So we have the atomic state, the nanostate, and the GAN state as a reference, which shows us different energy states. And we've been able to participate in each energy state by interacting energy states. So all of a sudden we have many possibilities. And so we have to choose. And we need some kind of simplicity. And the most simple is the plasma rule, where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. So this becomes a problem for us because when we have 2 forces come together, it becomes a conflict point, doesn't it? And that conflict point then becomes a binding zone. So is that binding good or bad? Well, I guess if you look at the outcome, if the binding zone is bringing you teamwork so that you can do more, be more, or it brings together war where you can damage more, and can you damage the other without damaging yourself? And so there's a trade-off, isn't there? The cost versus the benefit. Call that a cost-benefit analysis. And you determine, well, how much are you prepared to lose for how much you're prepared to gain? But is there a guarantee? There is a guarantee. By the plasma rule, the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. So you better know what you're feeding, because there's always a magnetical consistency, you see, because it always revolves around the neutron. The neutron is gravitationally neutral and is at the core. And then the electron is magnetical, it's negative, and it rotates around the neutron. Well, that's a very simple way to look at it, but there's a magnetical consistency, and that magnetical consistency is reference to the electron. Now, if we say the higher strength feeds the weaker strength, we look at the gravitational strength feeding the magnetical, because the gravitational strength is stronger. But we have more electrons, and those electrons are also feeding. So if they're weaker, how can they feed? Excuse me. If they are weaker, how can they be acting as if they are stronger. And so this becomes an anomaly. And a lot has to do with our point of view and our terms of understanding. And so let's try and explain that even more, because there's always a magnetical dependency. And the two most important fields are the laws of attraction and the laws of repulsion. So let's remember, attraction has the gravitational intensity, and the repulsion has the magnetical intensity. But the attraction, you see, is only part of the feedback, and the repulsion is the actual feeding. So which is it? Is the electron feeding, or is the neutron feeding? And if one is stronger than the other, how can you determine which one's doing the feeding? And if one is doing the feeding, then the other one must be doing the feedback. So which is it? And this is the problem that is facing humanity's civilization, because we seem to have this dependency on contentious issues. And so our arrival on this planet seems to be a bone of contention also. And so when we look at the civilization and we look at the basic 7 civilizations and we look at it through history, and we identify 7 of them because they all have the same story of the Great Flood. And so how is it possible for 7 civilizations to have the same story of the Great Flood and yet be different, be individual? And so, seeing as we're all part of the humanity's civilization, then why do we bother to identify ourselves individually? Why are some Asians and some, Middle Eastern and some Hispanic and some white, some black? Why all these differences? Why are we keeping track of those differences? And so, it enables the contentious issues, doesn't it? And that brings us to the subject today, because the whole purpose of the energy binding is for self-serving needs. And we've achieved that because we were born. So why do we continue in our lifetime to do the opposite? Take that energy binding at the expense of others who also need that energy of binding. And of course, that is the weakest, isn't it? So we have substituted the ability to get our energy from the highest source and taken it from the lowest source. And so it only stands to reason that if you interact with the lowest source, that only reinforces your position on the lower level. And that's where our problem stems from. And so through the cups of life, we've seen how we can elevate the energy levels from our emotional strength, our inner space, to produce the GANs. And we started with the physical wires and liquid and salt, and we created GANs of a higher energy. And the intermediate step, of course, was the nanocoating process. And so all of these GANSs were a radiance manifestation that created the CO2, calcium, zinc, copper, water, amino acid GANs. These are all GANSs. And so they are radiating energy through a field. And it's a higher energy. Higher than what? Higher than the basic element that you started with. So for instance, if we have a gold GANS, that is at a higher energy state, higher than gold. So all of these can be broken down into their elements. We too have elemental construction. our emotion, our physicality, our soul, is a combination of the interaction of the magnetic and gravitational field. So we have to look at each of these components as being an inertia field. And then bringing all three of these components together is an inertia field. So if we only look at the magnetical gravitational relationship, we say two fields, where 1 and 1 makes 2. But if we look at the cup of the soul, 1 plus 1 plus 1 creates 3. Well, what are the limits? How many more can we create? Who sets the limits? And why are there limits? And so if we look at the rest of the universe and we say, well, wait a second. Why is our little tiny perfect world so tiny? When we look at the cup of the universe and we see the coming together of the emotion of the zinc and the physicality of the copper and the connection with the carbon, and we see that in our brain, we're able to bring these two together, the left side and the right side of the brain, to bring our individuality together. So with respect to the brain, the 1 and the 1 is 2, but with respect to the cup of the universe, 1 plus 1 plus 1 is more than 3. And the thing is, we still have the ganses, we still have the brain, and we still have the physicality. So it's more. Well, how much more? And so when we look at the grand central station of the Earth ganses, we see that there's an awful lot more. And they have different characteristics, different colors, different properties. And of course, we put them in a nice periodic table of consistency, which shows the Earth space range details. And so we see some important things that we constantly reference to, like the amino acids, which are the construction coming together from hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. We see the mediums, the sodium, magnesium, potassium, and calcium. We see the emotional and physical constructs in the copper, zinc, gold, and iron. And we see the energy that is manifesting in the sulfur. And it's also is manifesting both in us as carbon beings, which are organic, and in the earth, which is inorganic, due to the fact that it's silicone-based. And yet the carbon and the silicone are the same family. So we're all one happy family, aren't we? We need to remember that. That's why we came here. So in the beginning, in order to come here, something had to be here. And so the neutron came before the atom and the PM tick. And so what are you? Are you the neutron? Are you the atom? Are you the electron, the proton, or the PM tick? And where did you come from? Was it dark where you came from? And someone said, let there be light, and voila, here you are. And so the coming of the principal matter is a result of the PM ticks in their magnetical energy state come together with the antimatter, dark matter, and the matter gen to bring together the plasmagen conversion, which is a Magrath condition representing the inertia condition of those other three states. So when you look at the Magrath, you don't look at the one result. Remember that it came together from the three different energy states. And then you have to remember that it came together from the PM ticks. And then you have to remember that these were just energy parceling units that came together from, well, somewhere else. And then you have to remember that the existence came somewhere. And so in order to manifest, it had to be an inertia field with the Earth space. So it seems like we have to take a lot into account. And it really, rocks our little tiny perfect world. But our tiny perfect world, the way that we see it, is basically a matter state dimension. And it's made of physicality and plasma. But the physicality is also plasma. So what is the difference? The physical can touch it and you can see it, but the plasma, you can't touch it and you can't see it. But in the physicality, being more dense, it's gravitational. And so it's part of the feedback. Whereas the plasma, being less dense, it's magnetical and it's part of the feeding. So somehow the feeding fed the feedback. So the plasma rule, where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength, this is where it comes into conflict, understanding. And so fundamentally, we're seeing many, many examples where man is feedback dominant. And so that's what we're reinforcing, our feedback, isn't it? So that becomes part of our core dependency to decide, are we electrons or positrons? Or are we neutrons and protons? It's kind of having a discussion with me and my shadow, isn't it? But there's a core dependency in terms of our Magravs state. So one thing we have is a gravitational conformation. And what's important to understand is that the hydrogen is a representation of a gravitational conformation. And it has a fingerprint, a unique fingerprint. And that fingerprint is either an emission spectrum or an absorption spectrum. But it has to do with light. And that's your first clue. When you can see the light, that tells you it's physical. When you can see the color, that tells you it's physical. And so when you look at the oxygen spectrum, it too gives you a gravitational conformation of the same thing. And you see the emission spectrum and it's unique. So you know it's oxygen and you know it's not hydrogen. But you know that it comes from light. And since you can see the light and you can see the color, then you know it's physical. And that's the rule. It's a very simple rule. And so we've been led to believe that everything that you see in color is everything. Well, everything that you see in color is everything that's in color, with the capabilities of everything that you can see. So can you see more? And that's where we come into the surface to volume ratios, which help us to identify the 3 belief feeding dimensions and the 4 experience feedback dimensions. You see, because when you understand the surface to volume ratios, then you understand which is negative. And understanding which is negative is very important in order to understand which is the giver. And then what constitutes the negative? And so based on the surface to volume ratio, the higher the surface to volume, the higher the negative charge. And that's the rule. And it's been a contentious issue because it's contrary to what some have been taught. But it becomes very important when you navigate. So we have 2 very important foundational navigation tools: surface to volume ratio and the plasma field strength feeding. Higher strength feeds the lower strength. So if, based on the surface to volume ratio, the smaller has a higher ratio, the smaller is negative. And so the positive feeds the negative. So the positive being the larger being the gravitational, the smaller being negative, the negative being magnetical. And so that's how you can figure it out. But we are the observer, and we're having trouble identifying which is which. And so what does that mean? When we look at things and try and identify what it is. So if we were saying that one is an inertia feeding of one, where 1 + 1 = 1. But which one? And so when we have this feeding, we know that the feeding is from 2, where we had the feeding of 1 plus the feeding of second 1, and to come together and they create the inertia of 1. So we can conclude that the coming together of the feeding inertias are greater than the feedback inertia. And we can conclude that the 1 is smaller. And then we can conclude that the 1 is negative. And if we understand that the negative is the giver, oh, wait a second, didn't we say that the gravitational is the giver? Well, let's remember the rules. And so we find that if you're going to give, then and only then can you take. And if you want to take, then you have to give. So we come into a conundrum here where how can you give if you don't have? So in order to give, you have to have. So you have to have first before you can give. Whereas in the plasma science, you have to give before you take. And this becomes the confounding rule. And it's only confounding because of our society and the way we look at things. And that's what we need to talk about today, because all of us here are gravitational the same way the oxygen and the hydrogen were here. So when we say let there be light, well, you can also say let there be humanity. Okay, so here we are. And we're all part of the nuclear family, right? And as part of the nuclear family, we see that 1 + 1 plus another 1, all different, come together to create more than 3. And so we see that within the nuclear family, there are fragments. So we look at the nuclear complexity as being an inertia field of all the fragments. And you say, well, the nuclear feeding is larger than the fragments. And yet the fragments make up the components of the nuclear complexity. So in order to maintain the nuclear feeding inertia, there has to be a giving and taking. And this is seriously important. And the reason I bring this up today is because the European nations, and for those of you who are supporting the panel here from Europe, thank you very much, because there are European soccer teams playing right now as we speak. And so it becomes a competition of different nations. So when we look at the humanity's civilization broken down and say into 7 civilizations, But then we look at the number of countries that are on this planet, and it's close to 200, even more fragments, and even more contentions, even more competitions. So we find that it really affects our emotions. And that's what chakras are. Chakras are a fingerprint of our emotions. And so many of us have chosen to identify the chakras, and we allocate them to certain things. But isn't it interesting that we have the 7 basic civilizations, that we have 7 basic chakras? But these chakras change color because they reflect our emotion. And that's one of the joys of soccer. And so it's very appropriate because Europe is very emotional about its soccer. South America is very emotional about the soccer. And I really want to pick on one particular character because it exemplifies everything that we're talking about. And it's really unfortunate for him because he's a marvelous soccer player. And Brazilians know him as Vinicius Jr. And he plays for Real Madrid in the Spanish league, but he also plays for the Brazilian national team. Marvelous player. And if you've ever played sport, you know how wonderful it is, the wonderful feeling, the emotion, scoring a goal, and how euphoric you feel. And I often wondered, because I had a chance at a career in sports, and it was short-circuited, and I was sad. But then I didn't understand what sports was all about. And so we looked at sports as an athletic event, and we looked at, say, wrestling as entertainment. And yet they were both reflecting of some kind of competition. And the truth of the matter is that sports is also an entertainment. And so you have someone like Vinicius, who is a tremendous talent, and people pay money to see that display. And not only do they see the talent, but they see the youth and the vitality. And as we all get older, that seems to diminish. And we accept that. And so we love to watch others who have this gift, and how they use that gift, and they entertain us, and we gladly pay for that. And as such, they become rewarded and they become wealthy. And isn't that what it's all about? To be wealthy. Wealthy with money. And to be adored by the public. And we're talking about millions of people around the world. But our chakras show our emotion. And for most of us, we can't see the chakras. People who are clairvoyant can see them. But our chakra levels tell the truth about us, because each of the colors means something. And so we try and attribute them to various parts of the body. And so this is not a class on what the individual components mean, but, you know, you can start with the reproductive system and go all the way up to the soul. And when being a Canadian, I didn't know much about chakras. And when I was introduced to this, and it isn't really the fact that I was Canadian, it's just that I wasn't exposed to this. Because understanding the nature of our emotion and the nature of our being is something more of the Far Eastern persuasion. They seem to be way more knowledgeable about that. And yet, here we are, Christopher Columbus in the New World, discovering something that everybody knows. And when I look at the various people who, shall we say, give massages, do chiropractic work, or do healing, there's also a contentious issue. Do we go from the higher to the lower, or do we go from the lower to the higher? So, we cannot even agree on this. So ironically, in the first instance, I was taught to bring the energy from the brain into the body and let that flow. And yet, when I see someone doing a massage, if it's a physical massage, I'm just making commentary from my own personal observation, not commenting on whether or not it's right or wrong. I'm just saying there's some from the head to the base. And then I watched someone who massaged the spine, and it seems to be a focal point, massage from the bottom up. And yet, that person did not touch the skin. They were massaging something else. And so they were massaging bindings. And those bindings were reflective of the flow of the chakras. The flow of the chakras. So if the mind is the builder, then the energy has to flow from the brain to the body. And the lowest energy state, of course, is our physicality in the reproductive cycle. And the highest energy is representative of our brain, which is the housing for the soul. And so the higher feeds the weaker. But when you become physically dominant, too many of us think the opposite way. In our physical prowess, might is right. And so we have to display our physicality, our strength, our virility, our matter state dominance. And so we have this contentious issue. So which is right? And the answer is actually both. And so here's where the problem lies. In idols. What is an idol? And so how do we go from adulation to idolatry? So all of us, we like to idolize. She is so beautiful, I wish I was like her. He is so smart, I wish I was like him. He is such a marvelous athlete, I wish I were like him. He is so young, I wish I were like him. And they are so wealthy, I wish I were like him. So we all idolize something. We kind of pattern our life that way. But most importantly, those we idolize want to be idolized, and that includes us as well. Say, oh, I idolize that, so isn't it nice to be idolized? So maybe I should be the idol. And then we see the problem begin. Whereas the idol, people serve you, and so you become idol. And one of those, shall we say, clues of becoming idolized is the length of the fingernails. And we see many of the ancient Chinese rulers, for instance, and they have these very long fingernails. I mean, really long. And so if you have long fingernails, it's very hard to do manual work. But when you have other people doing everything for you, maybe they do the thinking for you. So not only you become idle, but you become addle-brained. And what is the being addle-brained? It's where you become confused. And this is where we're at right now. We're confused and we're vague. And then, of course, this refers especially to thinking. And of course, an adult brain is a little brain. And since we have a tiny little perfect world, it only stands to reason that we have a tiny little perfect brain. And there are many synonyms for this, like befuddled, muddled, muzzy, woolly, woolly-headed, woolly-minded, confused, mentally confused, unable to think with clarity or act intelligently. You take your pick. They all are symbols of attraction, aren't they? Because it's the taking. Remember, the taking is part of the attraction. And in the plasma science, it's balanced by giving. So the taking is actually pulling. And once you have that taking, then it's enabling and it's positive. It's gravitational, right? When you take, you have more. So it becomes gravitational and it's part of the attraction. But that leads to ego abuse, where you take personal adulation. And so I'm picking on Vinicius Jr. because I see a problem. There's all taking and no giving as an extreme. Marvelous athlete, very useful, highly skilled, plays for club and country, and he's adored. And so he's taken that as a personal adulation. We don't know him personally. We only know him as an entertainer. But he's pulling personal idolatry. And that involves the enabling of personal abuse. As an entertainer, and especially a massively skillful someone, he has acquired positive personal wealth. And as such, is not only inflated his personal adulation and his personal idolatry, but also enabled his personal abuse. It's all part of his ego abuse. And I find this very amusing because it becomes a gravitational personal wind-up doll. And what do I mean by that? He takes an enormous amount of racial slurs, racial abuse, extreme criticism from the fans and in many stadiums around Spain. And there's a lot of abuse that's heaped on him. And it's kind of contradictory to the adulation that he receives. So the adulation he receives is from the people that he plays for. But the abuse that he receives is from people who he's playing against. And they found that they can really wind him up. And I must make a confession. There was one time in my playing experience, I only played as an amateur, is where I wound someone up. And it really feels good to wind them up, I must tell you. Because to see the reaction, you wind them up verbally, and it's as if their head explodes. And they go through a meltdown. But what's the result? The result is they get ejected from the game. And isn't that good for your team when the best player on the other team gets ejected? And so Vinicius Jr. gets ejected an awful lot, and he loses his temper very, very quickly because he gets wound up very easily. And the way he gets wound up is through verbal abuse. And why does he allow that to happen? Because he has demonstrated a belief in living the life of entertainment. In wrestling, there are good guys and bad guys. But, without the bad guys, there wouldn't be any good guys. And without the good guys and the bad guys having a contentious issue, well, there wouldn't be any show. And so the fans, some root for the bad guys and some root for the good guys. And that's all part of the entertainment. It's a lot of fun. But in terms of Vinicius Jr., he's living the life of the entertainment. And he's denying the reality because there's one thing for sure, that as he grows older, he will no longer have the personal adulation because he will no longer be playing for his team. And of course, he won't be having the youth. So that's one of the things that it'll also go. But you know what he will have? He will still be the wind-up doll. And that's the sad part about it. Because he doesn't see the game. He thinks the game is the way life should be. And this becomes a problem for us. We're all guilty of that. We all get wound up in what we do. And it's all part of the ego abuse. So what can we do to, shall we say, kill the ego? Well, we need to understand which direction the energy flows. And those who are clairvoyant can see the manifestation of this energy being the color of the aura. And so that's the first clue, that the color of the aura is physical because it's in color. And so if it's physical and yet it's an aura is not that physical, like you can't hang on to it, but you can feel it. And unless you're clairvoyant, you can't see it. But you certainly can see when someone gets wound up and they become overcommitted to that particular thing. So you can see how people change in their emotion. And so which way are we looking at it? So what is that which you give your time and attention to? The focal point of your mind. And what is it that causes the contention? The focal point of our survival. And so that becomes our lust in space. But the whole purpose of life is for learning. And so that learning becomes part of our retention. And we can carry that forward generationally and transgenerationally. And so we can see that that creates now a qualified intention, and this becomes a representation of the lust for life. So we have a crossing over here, and it's not meant to confuse. It's to understand that our physical existence is gravitational. Our intention is magnetical. Our lust in space is gravitational, but our lust for life is magnetical. And yet, the magnetical as a negative is a giver, and the gravitational of the higher strength feeds the lower strength. So when we talk about the magnetical, the repulsion, that's the giving, is balanced by the taking. So there's a pushing, but there's also an accommodating. And so it's negative as a giver, identifying it as the magnetical force fields of repulsion. And that is the representation that we have in our physicality, which is an inertia field that is created by the chakra and the soul. So we find that what we need to be is feeding dominant, because that's the giving. What we are is feedback dominant, which is the taking. And so Vinicius truly doesn't understand. I thought he was being an entertainer, but frankly, you can see the way he leads his life on and off the field. He truly believes his entertainment is part of the life. So for his skill and for his excellence, he's getting a monetary feedback and adulation, but he's also getting abuse. And so for his reaction to that abuse, he gets more abuse. So what is he giving and what is he taking? And is that abuse a result of what the fans are giving him, or is that abuse of what he is creating? So his abuse is, in a way, his fault, because we create our own reality. When you compare his reality as an athlete and to others as athletes, and you find many athletes are adored, but they are not abused verbally the way he is. He's extra special, verbally abused. And the more he protests, the more he gets abused. Isn't it interesting? And so he would question his intention. His intention, of course, is to eliminate the racism. But through his actions, he only foments more. It's sad. So we understand that the path link and susceptibility is based on the emission of attention and the emission of retention. And it interacts to create the emission of intention. So this creates a balance of contention, the contention of equality. No man should be abused. And it doesn't help when suddenly you score that goal that kind of neutralizes all the naysayers, and you throw oil on the fire by giving that one finger salute. And for some people, one finger is not enough. You have to get on the whole arm. And so all that does is heaps more abuse. So we see that the planes of our existence are in the three dimensions, the X, Y, and Z axis. And so if we look at the chakras, they are the same. They are created with respect to our physicality. They're based on our emission, and they're based on our emotion, which is highly changeable. And we go through the whole gamut from being very peaceful to being very cantankerous and all points in between. But the worst of all is when we lie, cheat, and steal, because that doesn't make the world go round. That just means that we are very physical. And so the inertia field becomes the dominant field. And there are various emotions that we go through, and even midpoints. And we change. Some of us are so changeable, it's unbelievable. We're not stable because we're products of our environment, and we get wound up. It's not a bad thing. It's a lot of fun. Huh. Well, what if it's destructive? Is that fun? For the sake of your emotion? Someone else has to suffer? Is that fun? Who is it fun for? Can you do one without the other? Can you be immune to that? So we see that there's a spectrum. And so we know that there's a high energy and there's a low energy. We also see that there's a high density and a low density. And then there is a comparison there. It goes from the ultraviolet to the infrared and all points in between. These are all the spectrum of light. And it's a balance between the gravitational and magnetical fields. And yet, when we look at it, it's such a tiny part of so many different frequencies. Other frequencies which we do not have the capability of seeing. And these frequencies also have a range, high frequency to low frequency. So the high frequency has the high energy, but the high density has the highest surface to volume ratio, meaning it is the smallest. So the smallest, which has the highest density, has the highest energy. And we have the capability of having an imagery of these spectrum. With radio waves, we have ultrasound. We can create that image. Obviously, we have photography and we have film, in the colored spectrum, we can see images. With X-rays, we can see images. Can we see images with the gamma rays or beyond? Well, why not? So now we know where the science is going. And if we see this, and those who are clairvoyant can see the chakras, but beyond the chakras, can we see the soul? Because those who are clairvoyant can see whether or not you're lying. And do you have to be clairvoyant to see that you're lying? Well, what else can we see? And that's what the future will bring. We can see the future. So we have various forms of image detection. We talked about photography and spectroscopy. There's microscopes, ultrasounds, thermography, right? Heat signatures, magnetic resonance, radar, sonar, X-ray. But then there's also the somatoscope, which ironically is illegal. We have satellites. Those are exclusive to the military. Night vision, again, very controlled. But there's clairaudience and there's clairvoyance. There's remote viewing. No one has dominion over those. And there are those who have stealth technologies, but they leave a signature trail in the chemtrails. And then, of course, advanced vision with the Hubble. And please stand by for the plasma vision that's coming. We all can see because we're all learning about the new transmutation process. So whether you're in the physical state, you can see the interdependence between the gravitational and magnetical fields. We can also see between the lower energy and the higher energy. And then even in the higher energy, same rules apply. The interdependency between the magnetical and the gravitational fields. So the inertia of the mind represents the same thing. So we see the interaction of the soul of the earth and the soul of the man, because those two things have to come together to manifest the physicality of man. Physicality of man cannot manifest without the physicality of the earth. So what we do know is that the soul of physicality emits a chakra. So that chakra is an emission of our interaction with the soul of the earth and the soul of the man. So the manifestation of the chakra is an inertia field. And it's from that that we have the manifestation of the physicality, which is an inertia field. So the same rules apply. So the inertia of the mind is also a combination of these fields. So we have to remember that everything that we see is a product. So what we experience is what we've created. It's not the other way around. So the roadmap to the plasma highway is where we have this intensity feeding, and it comes from the carbon-14 to the carbon-12. And then the feedback, which is the intensity feedback, back. And there's a gap. There's a 20% gap between the efficiency of the feeding, which gives us 80% of what we need. And we're still short that 20%. And it puts us in a contentious issue where we have everything that we want. Adulation, finance, glory, love, and we're still not happy because there's a deficiency. It has to do with man's disconnect, where man is hooked on everything that we see in the physicality, and we continue to feed it back. And we forget that the reason that we were outstanding athletes was God given. The reason we had the talent because it was God given. And our use is part of the feedback. And that feedback feeds back again. And so we get what we give. And we seem to think that it's enough. But it hooks us into a false sense of security. So we don't understand that the origin, book number one, the matter state inertia coming together, the antimatter, dark matter, and matter, but in various strengths. Some are stronger, some are weaker. And based on the surface to volume ratio, is the higher negative charge, and the negative is the giver. So here we come. Oh, where does it come from? Well, then there you go. So we have more than what meets the eye. And the soul will never lie. It always gives. And so the soul will give to the chakras, and the chakras interact and give to the physicality. And the physicality feeds it back. But we're short-circuited. There's a feedback short circuit. It puts us like a fish, hooked in the physical state. And you wonder if you're satisfied or are you hungry? Because we're hooked on life. And we should be hooked on life. But life is more than just what meets the eye. So we have to understand that that 20% that we crave for feeding me is the small, tiny, perfect little world. And there's so much more. And not only is our existence dependent on that, but the earth space matter state also has an inertia exactly the same way. And all the individual field strengths are all fragments of the complexity. And so we are also fragments of that complexity, 8 billion of us. And frankly, it's not enough. We don't have enough people to do all the work. We don't. If you take the inventory, so much of us are preoccupied with contentious issues. We're more interested in pursuing idolatry through adulation than we are through the giving, extending the surface to volume ratio. And we find that all of us together, 1 + 1 + 1, is more than the combination. We all are adding to the field strength ratio. This is all part of the inertia of the humanity that's involving the earth, but not just us. It involves the plants, it involves the animals, it involves all living things, because this is all part of the matter state plasma, the matter state inertia. And it is all from the point of view of the observer. So we have this matter state physicality, which is very good because it gives us gravitational stability. But we are the observer. We are the gravitational neutron, and we can choose. We can give in terms of our field strength as an observer, and we can change. That change comes about with respect to our susceptibility, understanding the 3 belief feeding dimensions and how they affect 4 experience feedback dimensions. So don't be the wind-up doll. Understand that it's a two-way street. You can't just blame because there's an attraction and a repulsion plus the magnetic. And there's a repulsion, attraction, plus the gravitational. It's all part of the natural creation, natural decay. So you as the maggrav plus your magnetical is part of your emission, and you as the maggrav plus your gravitational is part of the absorption. And so before you absorb, you have to emit. So if you're emitting hatred, you will absorb that first. And that's how the earth space works. And that's how the outer space. And where is this outer space? It's where the earth space came from. It's where we came from. It's where everything that we see, including the chakras, came from. It's a manifestation of the coming together of the dimensions of the X, Y, and Z axis. And so the universe is created the same way. It exists from energy. And because energy is always in motion, that's why it has a charge. It's a direction of motion. And since there's a motion, then things go from one place to the other. So all things are working in combination. So we look at the universal order of creation of matters, but each one is a universal order of creation of matter. And so how do we go from one matter to another matter? And that's through energy that is always in motion. So if we understand the soul food and tune into that, turn on to the power of the universe and drop out of our arrogance and our ego and understand that you provide the pattern, you will get the energy. And if you keep feeding that pattern and that energy that the pattern delivers could be abuse. So what do you want? Do you want peace and prosperity? Or do you want to substitute it for something else, some kind of gravitational dominance at the point of substitution? Because the intensity at that point equals zero and the outintensity equals zero. So all you have is the gravitational confirmation. That's what remains. And that's what dissolves. So that substitution point is that within that black hole. And this wonderful athlete has fallen into that black hole, not understanding what he's done and not understanding that he is the problem. He can't blame the fans. They pay for his services, and his services is to entertain. And they get suitably entertained by his tears, his frustration, and the amount of anger that he gets as a wind-up doll. And so all of us understand that we can go from one state to the other and beyond. But there's a barrier on the inside. There's a Coulomb barrier on the inside. And so we are now beyond Sanya. 1 year has passed. And we see the earth space consistency where all the periodic elements can manifest into the physicality, just like our reality, just like our physicality, and just like everything else. And so we realize that the strength of our field is based on the smallness. And so small spheres of matter state give us an earth space consistency, but it also is the barrier of our adult little brain. And we can see that in the graphs that show where, yes, we're trying to get into that transmutation space, but we're intense with our physicality and our souls are on the bottom. And our souls are carrying the burrs, the hanging on, and the baggage that we carry. So how do we bounce off the maggrav? And is it just a midpoint, or can we change it? And so we see that the speed of rotation will affect the transmutation transition. And so this blue planet has a balancing of the intensity and outintensity, and it is the color of blue. And so we know that when we see that color, we know that it's in physicality. But the pH of peace does not really have a color. There are many points on the field strength of the dove. So what we know is that the pH of peace is not visible. It needs reinforcing. It needs for us to give time and attention to it. It is lacking. It is lacking of our intensity and our intention. And so the call has gone out for all the research teams for the Kesh space plasma, because this is the true intention. We practice with the transmutation flight sessions. We have the next of 3, the March session coming up next week, and we'll conclude the April session. And we continue to train to understand that our chakras are just displaying a transitional state, and how effective are we in that? Because in order to get to that transmutation, it transcends the inertia field, this transmutation dimensions, which are reflected in the laws of conservation, which govern the covalent, trivalent, and tetravalent bonding attributes. And it is those that allow us to bond with others. And so the containment of inertia is manifest through the contention of equality. Can't be more equal. The soul of man cannot be abandoned nor compromised. And so a racial slur doesn't matter what color you are, someone is always giving you a racial slur, because the color of man is based on the integration with the soul of the man. That's the integrity of the man. And so we set up an antenna to get this message feeding and feedback manifestation. So we create whatever we manifest. And so we have to do this transmission of energy by tuning the transitions, where we select one force, which is magnetical and balanced by a force selection of another, gravitational force. The resulting selections feed the Magrav manifestation. So this selection manifestation is predetermined. So can our friend stop the racial abuse? Can our friend be more of what he wants to be, and be more of what the world needs to be? He has to enlarge his schemes of reference, because your emission of intention consistently affects the standard folding deviation and leaves no room for war by choosing the peace dome of intention. So the transmutation manifests in balance with the peace dome. Our friend is not at peace, and he's not at peace with himself. And he's certainly not at peace with the fans, doesn't understand the augmented reality. And we hope that he does, because there's a flux and a flow towards, to, into, within, through, and out of, from every charge, every form, all mass, matter, or substance. So intensify and extensify what we are. We are, and we need to be connected. That connection supports the flux of continuous change. And that connection is hooked on life, and we need to repeat this. And we have 582 weeks, the Knowledge Seeker workshops have been bringing us the greater oneness, the teachings that allow us to suddenly transcend the limitations of nuclear science. Suddenly, maybe months, maybe weeks, maybe years, not thousands and thousands and thousands of years. We've kept doing and repeating the same thing over and over. And guess what? We get the same results and the same abuse. It's time to stop. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute, teachings of plasma science. So welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers, learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. There's a World Peace Treaty. You have to sign it with yourself, as well as sign it with the planet. Choose it. Choose it all. Sign it. Sign it with true intention. Because egos thrive in the three-dimensional feedback inertia of idolatry. And self-importance is the feedback inertia of adulation. And can man go into outer space without a peace stone? Not really. And is the inertia of the present governed by the dimensions of history? If we allow it. So how do we impart the importance of self in a universal context? We have to be wise in feeding the chakra levels, traveling the physical transmission dimensions. The plasma science is delivered daily via the peace stone in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. And this is the end of the lesson. I hope you all enjoyed it and were suitably entertained.
Well, I could say amen to that, Alex. Fine job. But then, of course, we understand the amen is an idol of sorts. And one day we'll look up that statue. So we say, great job. And thank you for sharing this wide understanding. As Mr. Keshe said, it's not the quantity, it's the quality. And you certainly deliver quality. So thank you for sharing. Let's see if any of the participants have anything. I've never been familiar with the chakras. I've heard of them, and obviously there's something to them. But Mr. Keshe has made a number of comments on chakras and so on and so forth. And as far as these sports games, gosh, years ago I came to the conclusion this is really a soap opera for men, and I guess a lot of women as well. More with these team personalities and players. And hopefully we can come one day to this win-win situation that they play for the love and the beauty of the game rather than the winner or the loser. And this is just another thing that I think will change in time as we become more peaceful. And of course, changing our feeding dimensions should make us a bit more peaceful as we decide to destroy less entities to maintain our own. I think this is the way it will go in the future. And again, systems being provided for this to happen, to move away from the killing and to explore the universe. So great job, Alex. And let's see, anyone have a question or a comment or a thought they'd like to share? Okay, normally we conclude about this time. We can go a little later since we started later, but I know in Europe and other areas it's quite late. It's after midnight, I believe, or after 11, which may not be too late.
Well, of course, some Europeans are celebrating their team's victory and others are drowning their sorrows in their team loss. Both, of course, are probably drinking beer.
Right, just the way the abuse of the resources on this planet are going to be changed. It's nothing that I've created or done to make that happen, but within the Keshe Foundation and this advanced space technologies, there's all sorts of systems to end the abuse of resources, the abuse of the man, and so on. So we're very fortunate to be here. This will be one of the greatest years, and we'll just continue elevating from here. I think the whole nature of the discussion will be moved towards this advanced technology and, of course, finding out who we are in the universe, which, again, as he said, it's taken us 6,000 years to get to this point, and we've only been teaching about the soul and the central energies, and just for about 4 years. So we've made quite a bit of progress, but there's still quite a bit more to go. Anyone want to talk about the chakras or this understanding? And the one we had a bit of a discussion about Mr. Keshe saying the soul was outside of the body. It's never been inside the body. And maybe that's because we're connected to this creator of the creators. Again, I would still think it's within the body, but he did say something, the soul has never been in the body. But he's also said about the chakras. He said, I don't believe in the chakras, especially the seventh one, which I think is that little ball above the top of the head. But yet there is some anomalies. As he said in the last workshop, the soul is outside of the physicality when he was talking about the copper and the nano coating, meaning the soul was in the nano coating, which was a magnetic field outside of the copper. So again, it's for us to sort of take it the way you want to take it and how it befits you, and continue to add to your understanding. Yes.
That's a really important point you brought up, because if the soul is within in the head at the crossroads between the ears and the eyes and the nasal passage, it would have to be extremely small, and then at that point it has an extremely high surface to volume ratio. It becomes extremely negative, and so the soul becomes the giver. If the soul is outside of the body, then of course it's going to be much larger, which at that point is going to be more positive and therefore gravitational. And at that point, the gravitational becomes part of the feeding. So the soul is then clearly demonstrating a duality where it can be the giver in the magnetical state and it can be the giver in the gravitational state. And this is what we have to realize, that if we are in the feedback dominant physical state, then that's only half the picture. We're missing the feeding dominant state. And this is where the awareness comes in. So if we have to look at our physicality as being an inertia field combining the feeding dominance and the feedback dominance, because both are part of the learning experience. The feeding comes from everything that the universe is learning. The feedback comes from everything that you're learning. And so the feeding has to be adjusted. And if you're disconnected, then you're not only not getting the adjustment in terms of the feeding, but you're not getting what you need because the feedback is not there. And I think, we're all guilty of that. But this is not a condemnation of our feelings and shortcomings. We are trying to say that there's more that we have to take into account. So it's not a commentary of whether it's good or bad. It's not a commentary when you see the chakra and it represents the current emotional state. It can change. But can it be changed physically? There are physical actions that we can take, but they convey an emotional context. That it's the emotional context that affects it. So we need to be more sophisticated in the way we operate. And this becomes very, very difficult to understand, especially when might makes right. And that's the rule that we follow. So if we understand that the reason we have that might is because that is the inertia product of the feeding. So it is not for us to take that might and then impose it on someone else who doesn't have that mightiness. But use that mightiness to create an environment that allows them to elevate to your level of mightiness. Well, if they elevate to your level of mightiness, then you could come of the opinion that you're no longer mighty. Because in order for me to be mighty, someone has to be weaker. And if they are as mighty or mightier than me, then I lose my mightiness, and in fact, I become weaker. Well, is that what I want? Well, it all depends on what is your intention. And so if your intention is to facilitate the mightiness of the teamwork, then you will find that you become a part of a larger scheme. And when you're part of a larger scheme, then you are more mighty. And this is why artificial intelligence will never, ever exceed the mightiness of humanity, because the humanity created it. And it gives it strength. And so it'll be elevated. But it will not be elevated at the expense of our ability to continue feeding. It will only elevate us to be able to feed more. And in that process, we find that we would be more efficient, more skillful, and as a result, we become more capable. And when you become more capable, that puts you on the road to fulfilling your responsibility. Because one of the things about having responsibility is being able to fulfill your responsibilities. And you can't do that if you're not equipped, if you're not prepared, if you're not trained, and if you're not mighty. So we have to get mighty through our intention. And when we give that intention on behalf of, then we are giving more than we are taking. And so we have to have the possibility of taking more. And as long as we keep giving, the more we give, the more we can take. And so we have to give to the higher strength so that we can take from the higher strength, not rob and cheat the weaker strength. And one of the clues is to understand that the true intention is exhibited by the chakras, which are representative of the soul of physicality. And so that tells you everything that you need to know, whether or not to engage or to seek refuge. But avoiding the conflict is very important. However, it's our responsibility to ensure our security. So we need to set up the proper barriers in order to create that field of refuge and not allow abuse. So
Yes, and apparently we're going to have to look out for that or watch out for that in the universe as well. Apparently there's a number of beings who'd like to co-opt you into their universe. Maybe saying, you know, you'll be able to take, I can just imagine a soul going into the universe and not knowing how to feed itself, and is quite in need of energies or fields, and then meets a charlatan of sorts and sort of capitulates to this taking and feeding or a different way. So
the
I think,
thing,
yeah,
that's a really good point, Mark. So sorry if I could just interject.
yeah, please.
The point being is that right now we have the impression, or we give the impression that we are a bunch of losers. But the thing is, if we keep doing the things that keep us losers, then nothing will change. But if we use that as a learning exercise and then we apply it, we apply what we learned, then it gathers the strength. So if you want to join a team and they are nothing but winners, they don't know what it's like to lose, that team is missing something. They will be in a shock. But if you have a team that has done a lot of losing, but yet each time they lose, they elevate their position, well, that's a team that you want to go for, because that is a team that is changing the way that they are operating. You don't do what you did before and expect different results. You incorporate that which you have made a mistake and you change. And then with that, you try again. So it's not the losing, it's what you do as a result of the losing. And then you find in the competition of life, if you will, if you want to put it that way, the losers become the winners. And it's not a matter of winning or losing. There is something else that's missing in life. And so if your life revolves around your physical attributes and your youth and your strength, which are also representative of your physical attributes, what happens when that diminishes? What's left? And this is the whole point. There's more that meets the eye. And so what meets the eye is the inertia field. So open up and let, shall we say, the sunshine in. Thanks so much, Mark, and thanks everybody for allowing me to present. I hope you've enjoyed this little journey into the entertainment world.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Anyone else have a comment or a question or something they'd like to share? I want to play Keep Keshe Foundation Free for Humanity, become a trial volunteer. And of course, you don't have to interact with the doctors to be a trial volunteer. You can buy small products out of the Keshe Foundation store and give feedback. I think that's what a lot of these products are for at this point in time, for you to give feedback to confirm the team is on the right track or they're accomplishing what they set out to do. So whether you participate in the transmutation session or you buy small products from the Keshe Foundation store, it's all keeping the Keshe Foundation free for humanity. And you're a trial volunteer, as I see it, in both ways.